An empire built on roads, legions, law, and fear once ruled the known world. Its armies crossed mountains. Its governors judged kings. Its emperors were honored with incense, temples, and titles that sounded dangerously close to divine. And yet, from one of its occupied provinces, from a movement so small it barely registered in Rome's imagination, came a faith centered on a man the empire had executed. No army marched under his name. No throne was seized. No fortress fell. Still, centuries later, Rome would kneel before the symbol of the crucified man. At first, the story almost feels impossible. The Roman Empire was not easily impressed. It absorbed gods, languages, customs, and kings with a cold political patience. But Christianity was not simply absorbed. It spread, endured, adapted, and eventually altered the empire from within. To understand how that happened, we have to slow down. Not to chase a simple miracle story. Not to pretend the answer is hidden in one emperor's dream, one battle, or one decree. The truth is more human than that, and more unsettling. It begins in a conquered land, under foreign rule, where execution was public and power was meant to be unforgettable. It moves through crowded ports, rented rooms, private letters, burial clubs, whispered prayers, and communities that seemed harmless until they refused to behave like everyone else. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the question is not only how Christianity survived Rome. The deeper question is why Rome, with all its temples, soldiers, and laws, could not stop a movement born beneath its own shadow. Chapter 2. A faith born under occupation. To understand the rise of Christianity, we have to begin far from marble Rome. Not in the Senate, not in the imperial palace, not in the parade grounds where officers measured the world in roads, taxes, and troop movements. We begin in Judea, a land with a long memory and very little patience for foreign masters. By the 1st century, Judea existed under Roman rule, though not always in the same administrative form. Sometimes Rome governed through client kings, sometimes through prefects and governors. Either way, the message was clear enough. The empire did not need to be present in every village to be felt. It appeared in coins, in taxes, in soldiers, in legal authority, and in the terrible Roman habit of turning punishment into public instruction. Crucifixion was part of that instruction. It was not merely a method of execution. It was a political language. Rome used it most often against slaves, rebels, bandits, and those considered threats to public order. It was meant to humiliate the condemned and warn the living. A crucified body said, in the simplest possible terms, this is what happens when imperial power is challenged. That is why the execution of Jesus of Nazareth matters not only as a religious event, but as a Roman act. The details of his final days are preserved most fully in Christian writings, and historians approach those texts carefully, aware that they are works of faith as well as memory. But the broad fact that Jesus was executed under Roman authority is one of the firmer points in the story. He died not as a battlefield commander, not as a crowned rival emperor, but as a condemned man in a restless province. From Rome's perspective, this should have been the end. There was nothing unusual about another executed provincial. Judea had produced trouble before, and it would produce trouble again. Messianic hopes, prophetic movements, apocalyptic warnings, local unrest. These were not mysteries to the authorities. Rome did not need to understand every theological nuance to recognize instability when it appeared. But the first Christians made a claim that Rome could not easily process. They believed Jesus had been raised from the dead. This was not a minor adjustment to grief. It was the engine of the entire movement. Without that belief, Jesus might have been remembered as a teacher, a prophet, perhaps a failed messianic figure whose followers scattered after his death. Instead, his followers came to believe that the execution had not disproved his mission. Somehow, in their understanding, it had revealed it. Here the historian must move carefully. We cannot step inside the private experiences of the earliest believers with absolute certainty. We can say that they were convinced enough to reorganize their lives around the claim. They gathered. They preached. They interpreted older Jewish scriptures through this new conviction. They spoke of forgiveness, judgment, resurrection, and the kingdom of God. They did not begin by calling themselves a separate religion in the modern sense. They were Jews arguing from within the world of Jewish expectation, convinced that God had acted decisively through Jesus. At first, that made the movement both intense and small. It began in the margins, among people with little obvious power: fishermen, artisans, local followers, traveling preachers, women who appear in the tradition as witnesses and supporters, households that became meeting places. Not the kind of circle that would alarm a world empire at first glance. And that is one of the easy things to misunderstand. Christianity did not appear before Rome as a fully formed institution, with basilicas, councils, creeds, and imperial patrons. In the beginning, it was fragile, personal, local. It moved by testimony before it moved by architecture. It lived in spoken memory before it lived in public monuments. No Roman official looking at the earliest followers of Jesus would have seen the future religion of emperors. They would have seen a Jewish sect centered on a disturbing claim about a man Rome had already killed. That difference matters. Empires are often very good at seeing armies and very bad at seeing ideas while they are still small. Rome could count soldiers. It could count taxes. It could map roads, ports, grain shipments, and fortified borders. But a conviction moving through families, meals, letters, and whispered arguments in marketplaces was harder to measure, especially when it did not look like conquest. The first Christians were not trying to take cities by force. They were trying to persuade souls. That sounds gentler, and in many ways it was. But it also made the movement difficult to crush in the usual imperial way. There was no capital to capture, no royal bloodline to extinguish, no single fortress where the problem could be trapped. There were only people. People who believed that a crucified man had been vindicated by God. For many in the Roman world, that claim would have sounded absurd. Crucifixion was supposed to erase honor. It was supposed to make a person ridiculous, polluted, finished. To proclaim a crucified man as Lord was not simply bold. It inverted the empire's moral grammar. Rome said power proved itself by domination. The Christians said God had been revealed through humiliation, suffering, and resurrection. That was not yet a threat to the legions, but it was a threat, eventually, to the imagination. A movement can remain politically invisible for a long time when it gathers in homes, speaks in familiar religious language, and grows person by person. Rome had larger worries. Governors had disputes to manage, taxes to collect, roads to protect, and local elites to flatter. The earliest Christians were not the empire's central problem. Not yet. But something had begun that Rome's instruments of control were not designed to notice. In an occupied province, beneath the weight of imperial law, a memory of execution became a message of victory. A shameful death became a proclamation. A defeated body became, for believers, the sign that death itself had been challenged. And from that reversal, the movement took its first breath. Chapter 3. Roads, Ports, and the Hidden Network of Empire. Rome did not build its roads for Christianity. It built them for armies, taxes, messengers, merchants, governors, and grain. The empire was practical before it was poetic. A road was not a symbol of unity to a Roman administrator. It was a way to move a legion quickly, send orders efficiently, and remind distant provinces that the center still had reach. And yet, those same roads became one of the quiet reasons the Christian movement did not remain trapped in Judea. This is one of the strange ironies of empire. Power often creates systems for its own control, then discovers that other people can use them for different purposes. Rome made movement easier across the Mediterranean world. It connected cities that might otherwise have remained more isolated. It made travel dangerous, still, but more possible than it had been in many earlier worlds. A message could now move along imperial arteries, not instantly, not safely, not like a modern broadcast, but steadily. A traveler leaving the eastern Mediterranean could pass through ports, market towns, administrative centers, and Jewish communities scattered across the empire. A letter could be carried by a trusted companion. A merchant could bring news from one city to another. A household could host a guest, and by evening, a small room might become a place of argument, prayer, and persuasion. Christianity did not spread first through temples, it spread through contact. That detail matters, because it keeps us from imagining the early movement as something organized from the top down. There was no Christian ministry of expansion in Jerusalem drawing lines on a map. There were apostles, teachers, missionaries, migrants, craftsmen, women of means, slaves, freed people, and ordinary believers carrying a message through the normal movement of life. The Roman world was full of motion. Ships crossed the Mediterranean with oil, wine, grain, pottery, metals, books, rumors, and disease. Cities were crowded with newcomers. Some people moved because trade pulled them. Others because military service relocated them. Some were enslaved and taken far from home. Others followed opportunity, patronage, family, or survival. The empire liked to imagine itself as ordered, but beneath that order was a constant human current. Christianity entered that current. The earliest Christian communities often appeared in cities, and this was no accident. Cities were where strangers met. Cities held synagogues, marketplaces, workshops, bathhouses, courts, docks, and rented rooms. They were noisy, unequal, and socially restless. They were also places where new ideas could travel faster than in isolated villages. The synagogue network was especially important in the beginning. Because the first followers of Jesus came from within Judaism, they entered a world already connected by scripture, diaspora communities, shared festivals, and debates about God's promises to Israel. In many cities around the Mediterranean, Jewish communities had long existed before Christian preaching arrived. These communities provided the earliest missionaries with an audience that could understand the language of Messiah, resurrection, covenant, and the God of Israel. But that same starting point created tension. Some Jews accepted the Christian message. Many did not. The disagreements could be intense. because they were family arguments before they became arguments between separate religions. The early movement's relationship with Judaism was not a clean break at the beginning. It was a painful, uneven separation over time. This is where the letters become important. A letter seems like a small object beside an empire, a thin thing, folded, carried, read aloud, copied, passed on. But early Christianity was shaped by letters in a way Roman authorities could easily underestimate. Letters allowed distant communities to feel connected. They corrected disputes. They carried teaching. They gave scattered believers the sense that they belonged to something larger than the room where they met. A local group in Corinth, Antioch, Ephesus, Thessalonica, or Rome could hear words sent from somewhere else and realize that their private struggle was part of a wider story. That is a powerful thing. The empire had its official communications, of course. Orders traveled through administrative channels. Edicts could be posted. Governors could write reports. But Christian letters worked differently. They did not need official permission to matter. They traveled by trust. They were read in gatherings where people listened not as subjects receiving commands, but as members of a community receiving instruction, encouragement, and warning. The movement grew through repetition, but not mechanical repetition. A story told in one house, a meal shared in another, a visitor welcomed because he carried a name known to a friend, a widow helped, a slave addressed as a brother, a wealthy patron opening a courtyard, a dispute over food, purity, leadership, or doctrine, a prayer spoken in Greek, Aramaic, Latin, or local accents. Each moment was small. Together, they made a network. Rome understood networks of power. It understood patronage. It understood family alliances. It understood trade routes and military chains of command. But the Christian network was unusual because its deepest bond was not ethnicity, city, class, or legal status. It was confession. Belief became a kind of portable homeland. That did not mean early Christians were socially equal in every practical sense. We should not romanticize them too easily. Their communities still existed inside the hierarchies of the ancient world. Wealth mattered. Gender mattered. Slavery remained a brutal reality. Disputes were frequent enough that some of our earliest Christian texts spend a surprising amount of time correcting behavior. But even with those limits, Christianity offered a new way for people to imagine belonging. In a city where many residents were migrants, dependents, laborers, or people cut loose from older village ties, that mattered. The empire could give someone a legal identity. A city could give them work. A patron could give them protection. But a Christian community could give them a story in which their suffering, discipline, and hope were seen by God, and it could travel. That is the key. The movement was not tied to a single sacred landscape in the way Rome might have expected. Jerusalem mattered deeply. Judea mattered. The memory of Jesus' life and death mattered. But Christianity could plant itself elsewhere because its central practices could be carried into new spaces: teaching, baptism, shared meals, prayer, scripture, moral instruction, care for one another, and the proclamation of the risen Christ. A rented room could become sacred. A letter could become a lifeline. A port city could become a seedbed. The Roman Empire, without intending to, gave Christianity a map. Its roads and sea lanes did not create the faith, but they gave believers channels through which to move. Its cities did not make the message persuasive, but they gathered the kinds of people who might hear it. Its common languages did not remove cultural differences, but they made communication easier across vast distances. This is not the story of Christianity spreading because Rome was weak. Not yet. In many ways, Christianity spread because Rome was strong. Strong enough to connect the world. Strong enough to impose routes, ports, and urban systems. Strong enough to make the Mediterranean feel, at least for some travelers, like a single arena of movement. The empire had built a body for command. Through that body, another message began to circulate, and by the time Rome noticed that this message was more than a local disturbance, it was no longer confined to the place where it had begun. It had moved through harbors, homes, workshops, and letters. It had crossed from Judea into the wider Roman world, not like an invading army, but like a pulse moving under the skin of the empire. Chapter 4. The message Rome could not easily classify. Rome was not offended by religion in the way a modern person might expect. The empire was crowded with gods. There were old household gods, civic gods, imported gods, mystery cults, philosophical schools, healing sanctuaries, local deities with names that sounded strange in Latin, and grand public rituals performed beneath the gaze of officials who may or may not have felt much personal devotion. Rome did not usually demand that everyone worship in the same way. It was not trying to create one empire-wide church. Its genius, if we can call it that, was more flexible and more political. Rome could absorb. A conquered people might keep their gods, so long as those gods did not become banners of rebellion. A foreign cult might enter the city, so long as it could be managed, regulated, or domesticated. Religion was not just belief, it was a form of public order. Sacrifice kept the relationship between community, gods, and state properly maintained. It said, "We belong here. We honor what protects us. We do not endanger the city by neglecting the unseen powers." In that world, Christianity was difficult to place. It was not simply another Eastern cult with exotic rituals. It was not only a philosophy, though Christians argued about virtue, the soul, death, and truth. It was not just a burial society, though burial mattered deeply. It was not a political party, though its language carried dangerous implications. It was not a rebellion, at least not in the ordinary military sense. And yet, it refused to behave like a harmless private devotion. The trouble began with exclusivity. Many people in the Roman world could honor several divine powers without feeling contradiction. You might sacrifice at a civic festival, keep household rituals, consult a healing god, admire a philosophical idea of the divine, and still participate in local customs. Religion was not always about choosing one truth and rejecting all others. It was often about performing the right duties in the right places. Christians said no, not always with the same boldness, not always without fear, not always consistently. But at the heart of the movement was a demand that made compromise difficult: loyalty to one God and to Christ as Lord. That word Lord could be spiritually rich inside Christian worship, but it also lived in a world where emperors were praised with titles of power and reverence. A Christian did not need to be plotting treason for Roman ears to hear something uncomfortable. The empire could tolerate many gods. It struggled with a God who tolerated no rivals. This is where we must be careful. Early Christians were not always persecuted simply because Roman officials understood Christian theology and rejected it in some abstract debate. More often, suspicion grew out of public behavior. Christians would not take part in sacrifices that others considered basic civic responsibility. They avoided rituals tied to the imperial cult. They rejected the gods of the city, not as minor beings deserving polite respect, but as false or even dangerous. To Roman society, that refusal looked arrogant at best and threatening at worst. Imagine a town festival, incense rising, local elites present. The gesture is public, expected, almost ordinary. A pinch of incense, a few words, a ritual action that says one belongs to the civic body. Then a small group refuses, not because they are lazy, not because they forgot, but because they believe the act itself is a betrayal of the true God. To the Christians, it is conscience. To the neighbors, it can look like contempt. That difference explains much of the tension. Rome did not always care what people believed in the private corners of their minds. It cared what they did in public. And public religion was tied to loyalty. To refuse sacrifice was not merely to hold a different opinion. It was to step out of the shared ritual life that supposedly protected the whole community. The accusation of atheism, strange as it sounds now, grew out of this. Christians believed in God, of course, but to many pagans, they appeared godless because they rejected the visible gods, the temples, the images, and the sacrifices that structured public life. They had no cult statue in the usual sense, no traditional altar in the civic square, no easy place in the familiar map of worship. A community that worshipped an unseen God and refused the gods everyone else honored could be called atheist without irony. But Christianity did not only refuse, it offered. That is what made it more than a stubborn negation. The Christian message promised salvation, not merely local protection or civic blessing. It spoke of sin, mercy, judgment, resurrection, and eternal life. It gave ordinary suffering a place inside a cosmic drama. It claimed that the weak were not invisible to God. It insisted that slave and free, male and female, rich and poor, stood before the same divine judge. We should not flatten this into a modern slogan of equality. The early churches did not erase social hierarchy overnight. A slave did not walk out of a gathering and magically become free in Roman law. Women could hold influence in some Christian circles while still living in a deeply patriarchal world. Wealthy patrons remained important. Human beings rarely become as radical in practice as their highest ideals sound in prayer. Still, the spiritual claim had force. Before God, status could be relativized. The poor could be honored. The widow could be protected. The infant left exposed by a cruel society could be seen as a life with divine value. The prisoner could be visited. The dead who could not afford impressive funerals could be buried with care. These were not just acts of kindness. They were arguments made with bodies, food, money, and time. Christianity was building a moral community. And moral communities can be more durable than crowds. A crowd gathers for excitement and disperses when the excitement fades. A moral community tells its members how to live when no one is applauding. It disciplines desire. It regulates sex, food, money, anger, speech, charity, and loyalty. For outsiders, that discipline could look severe, even antisocial. For insiders, it could feel like rescue from a world of chaos, exploitation, and loneliness. This made Christianity attractive and suspicious at the same time. It asked much of people. It offered much in return. It gave converts not only beliefs, but a pattern of life. There were teachings to learn, habits to adopt, sins to confess, brothers and sisters to care for, leaders to obey or argue with, and a future to hope for. The movement did not depend only on a beautiful idea. It formed people into communities that could remember, repeat, correct, and endure. Rome could classify a temple. It could classify a philosophical school. It could classify a burial club, a trade association, a foreign cult, even a rebellious sect if it behaved obviously enough like one. But Christianity blurred categories. It was intimate like a household, expansive like a mission, exclusive like a jealous religion, ethical like a philosophy, organized like an association, and universal in its ambition. It did not seek one more shrine inside the Roman world. It proclaimed a truth that, if taken seriously, stood above the Roman world. That was the problem. Not that Christians had swords, they had a claim, and the claim quietly rearranged everything it touched. The emperor was not ultimate. The city's gods were not guardians of final truth. Death was not the last authority. Honor was not proven by rank. Shame could become glory. A crucified man could be called Lord. For a while, Rome could overlook such language when spoken by small groups in private rooms. But as those rooms multiplied, the question changed. What looks harmless when whispered by a few can begin to sound like defiance when spoken by thousands. Chapter 5. The Power of the Invisible Community. An empire can be seen. That was part of its strength. Rome announced itself in stone, bronze, banners, uniforms, milestones, aqueducts, tax records, and public punishments. Its presence was not meant to be subtle. Even when the emperor was far away, the empire had a talent for making distance feel smaller. A coin in your hand carried a face you might never meet. A road beneath your feet reminded you who had ordered the world into lines. The early Christian community worked differently. Much of its power was almost invisible from the outside. Not secret in the sense of a conspiracy, though outsiders sometimes imagined it that way. Invisible because its most important work happened in ordinary spaces. Houses, courtyards, workshops, sick rooms, gravesides, shared meals, and the quiet management of human need. This is not the kind of power empires usually respect at first. Rome understood wealth. It understood office. It understood family prestige and military rank. It understood the public monument, the legal privilege, the spectacle. But what exactly was the empire supposed to make of a group that gathered before dawn, called one another brothers and sisters, collected money for the poor, cared for widows, remembered prisoners, and treated burial as a sacred obligation? On paper, it could look minor. In practice, it could change a life. The ancient city was not a gentle place for the exposed and unsupported. A person without family, patronage, money, or legal protection could fall quickly. Illness could ruin a household. Death could leave a widow vulnerable. An orphan could become someone else's burden, or no one's. Burial, which carried deep social and religious meaning, could be expensive. Hunger did not wait politely for philosophy to finish speaking. Christian communities entered precisely these places, where imperial grandeur often had little to offer. They did not eliminate poverty. They did not create a paradise hidden inside the Roman world. We should resist that sentimental picture. Early Christian groups had conflicts, failures, exclusions, and arguments over money and leadership. Some members behaved badly enough that their own texts scold them with impressive energy. Human nature did not stop at the church door, but the communities developed habits that made them unusually resilient. They organized care. Widows and orphans were not just sad images in moral speeches. They became recurring tests of communal faithfulness. The sick could be visited. The hungry could be fed. Travelers could be hosted. The poor could be remembered in collections. The dead could be buried with dignity. In some places, Christian burial associations and mutual aid practices gave members a kind of protection that was both practical and emotional. For someone living near the edge of survival, this was not abstract theology. It was bread. It was a hand on the shoulder when the household had gone cold. It was the knowledge that someone would sit your name after you died. This is one reason Christianity's appeal cannot be explained only by doctrine or only by politics. Ideas matter, but ideas become persuasive when they are embodied. A promise of resurrection sounded different when spoken by people who did not abandon the dying. A message about divine love gained weight when a community used its own limited resources to protect the vulnerable. The invisible community made the invisible God socially visible. That may be one of the most important transformations in the story. To outsiders, Christians worshipped a God without a statue, refused temples in the usual civic sense, and gathered in ways that seemed suspiciously private. But to insiders, God's presence was not proven by marble or incense. It was encountered in shared discipline, mercy, prayer, and obligation. The community itself became part of the evidence. Not perfect evidence, human evidence. Messy, uneven, and often compromised, but visible enough to attract attention. There was also a psychological power in belonging to a group that crossed some of the ordinary lines of Roman society. The language of brotherhood and sisterhood was not unique to Christians, but in Christian hands it carried an unusual theological charge. A slave and a free person might still return to very different legal lives after gathering, but inside the community they heard themselves addressed under a higher identity. A wealthy believer might still have influence, but that influence was now supposed to be judged by generosity, not only status. Again, the gap between ideal and reality could be wide, but ideals can still disturb the world even when people fail to live up to them. A Roman household was built on hierarchy. A city was built on rank. Public honor depended on recognition by others. Christianity did not erase these structures immediately, but it placed another structure over them: the household of God. That phrase was not decorative. It gave people a new social imagination. It suggested that the deepest family was not always the one written in bloodline or law. For migrants, slaves, freed people, widows, artisans, and others living amid uncertainty, this could be profoundly attractive. The empire offered order. The church offered attachment. And attachment is not a small thing. Modern viewers sometimes underestimate the loneliness of the ancient city. We picture crowded streets and assume that crowding prevented isolation, but a crowd can be one of the loneliest places on earth. Cities brought opportunity, but they also uprooted people from older protections. They forced strangers into contact without guaranteeing trust. Christianity created trust through discipline. That discipline could be demanding. Converts were expected to change behavior. Sexual ethics, honesty, charity, anger, worship, family life, and loyalty all came under pressure. A person did not merely add Jesus to an already crowded shelf of spiritual options. The movement asked for reorientation. This made conversion costly. It also made membership meaningful. A group that asks almost nothing may be easy to join, but it can be easy to leave. A group that asks for a whole life may become, paradoxically, harder to abandon. The sacrifices themselves create seriousness. Fasting, prayer, giving, confession, teaching, and moral correction formed a rhythm. The believer was not simply entertained. The believer was trained, and training produces endurance. Here, Rome's weakness was not that it lacked institutions. Rome had many. Its weakness was that most imperial institutions did not reach the intimate wounds of ordinary life. The state could punish theft, but it could not make you loved. It could build a road, but it could not sit beside your bed during fever. It could sponsor games, but it could not promise that your suffering had eternal meaning. The Christians could not always heal the fever either, but they could stay. That presence mattered during crises, especially when disease, famine, or social disorder loosened the bonds that held cities together. In such moments, a community already trained to care for its own could become a refuge. And when care extended beyond its own members, even imperfectly, it became a form of witness more persuasive than argument. This is where the movement's quiet power becomes clearer. Christianity did not conquer Rome first by winning debates in imperial halls. It won trust in places too small for official history to notice. A bowl of food, a collected coin, a burial shroud, a visit to a prisoner, a widow's name remembered, a child not discarded as worthless, a dying person not left alone. None of these acts looked like a revolution, but together they formed a rival vision of what a human being was worth. That rival vision was dangerous in a way no legion could easily answer. It did not attack the empire's walls. It challenged the emotional and moral foundations beneath them. It said that the weakest person in the room might matter infinitely to God. It said that honor could belong to the humble. It said that community did not have to be built only on blood, rank, patronage, or citizenship. Rome had made the world visible through power. The Christians made another world visible through care. And in the long struggle between spectacle and belonging, belonging proved harder to extinguish than Rome expected. Chapter 6. Why Rome began to fear the Christians. Fear rarely begins with understanding. More often, it begins with confusion. For a long time, many Romans did not quite know what to do with the Christians. They were not an army. They were not a nation. They were not easily reduced to one ethnic group, one temple, one city, or one political faction. They gathered in private, but claimed to possess a truth meant for everyone. They spoke of peace but refused rituals that others considered essential to public safety. They prayed for rulers, yet would not worship the gods who guarded the ruler's world. To Romanize, this was not just strange, it was socially dangerous. The first layer of suspicion came from secrecy. Christians met in homes and private rooms, sometimes before dawn, sometimes away from public ritual life. To believers, this was practical and devotional. They had no great public temples of their own. They gathered where they could. But societies under pressure often mistrust what they cannot see, and the Roman world was no exception. Rumor entered the empty spaces. Outsiders heard that Christians called one another brothers and sisters, shared sacred meals, spoke of eating and drinking in symbolic language, and loved one another with intense loyalty. without context, and with a generous amount of hostile imagination, enemies could twist these practices into grotesque accusations. Some charges made against Christians were almost certainly slanders, shaped by fear rather than evidence. But slander does not need to be accurate to be powerful. It only needs to sound plausible to people already uneasy. Then there was the accusation of atheism. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. Christians were intensely religious. They prayed, fasted, read scripture, worshipped, and organized their lives around God. But in the Roman setting, atheism did not simply mean disbelief in every divine power. It could mean rejecting the gods that society recognized. Christians denied the gods of the cities. They would not honor the divine images. They rejected sacrifice to the traditional deities. From their perspective, they were faithful. From the perspective of their neighbors, they were refusing to participate in the shared maintenance of the world. This matters because Roman religion was not only personal comfort, it was civic insurance. Sacrifice was part of the relationship between the city and the gods. If the gods were neglected, disaster might follow: plague, famine, military defeat, fire, earthquake, civil disorder. We may hear that and think of superstition. A Roman magistrate might have heard responsibility. So when Christians refused to sacrifice, the problem was not merely that they held a private opinion. The problem was that their refusal seemed to endanger everyone else. In a modern society, a person can decline a public ritual and still remain a citizen in good standing. In the Roman world, public religion and public loyalty were more tightly bound. To step away from sacrifice was to step away from the visible language of belonging. And if enough people stepped away, anxious minds could ask a terrifying question: what if the gods withdraw their protection? Christians became convenient suspects, not always, not everywhere. Not every Roman official spent his days obsessing over them. Most governors had more immediate concerns: taxes, lawsuits, disorder, local rivalries, imperial correspondence, and the endless work of keeping peace without appearing weak. But when trouble came, Christians were easy to blame because they were already marked as different. They did not join the ritual gestures that reassured the community. They were accused of hating the human race, not because they literally hated humanity, but because they appeared to reject the customs that held society together. They avoided certain festivals. They condemned practices others considered normal. They called people out of old loyalties into a new allegiance. They could seem cold toward civic celebration, even when they were deeply committed to charity. This is one of the central contradictions in the Roman fear of Christianity. Christians could be among the most caring people in a city and still be viewed as enemies of the city. Their care operated through a different logic. It did not flow from devotion to the city's gods or pride in the empire's rituals. It flowed from loyalty to Christ and obedience to one God. That made it morally impressive to some and politically suspicious to others. Rome did not require every subject to love the emperor with poetic sincerity. It required public signs of order, a sacrifice, an oath, a gesture of reverence, a visible acknowledgement that the imperial world and its divine guardians deserved honor. Many people could perform these actions without feeling much inner conflict. Christians could not. At least, not without betraying the core of their faith. This refusal sharpened the Roman dilemma. If Christians were punished, they could appear stubborn but also courageous. If they were ignored, their numbers might grow. If they were allowed to reject public sacrifice openly, Others might wonder why the old obligations mattered at all. The empire was not afraid because Christians were numerous at first. It became afraid because they were uncompromising in a system built on managed compromise. Rome had spent centuries turning difference into order. Local gods could stay if they made peace with Roman rule. Elites could keep prestige if they served imperial interests. Cities could preserve customs if they paid taxes and avoided revolt. The empire did not need everyone to become Roman in the same way. It needed people to fit. Christians did not fit neatly. They could be loyal in ordinary matters, pay taxes, work trades, raise families, serve neighbors, and pray for peace. Yet they also insisted that ultimate loyalty belonged somewhere Rome could not command. That distinction may sound subtle in a quiet room. Under pressure, it becomes explosive. Who has the final claim on a human being? The emperor, the city, the ancestral gods, the family, or the god worshipped by this growing, stubborn, unclassifiable movement? For Christians, the answer was clear. For Rome, the answer was intolerable if made too public. And so fear gathered in layers: fear of secrecy, fear of impiety, fear of divine anger, fear of social separation, fear that a movement without weapons might still weaken the rituals that made empire feel sacred. This is why Roman hostility was not only cruelty, though cruelty certainly appeared. It was also a crisis of classification. Authorities were trying to decide whether Christians were harmless eccentrics, illegal associations, religious deviants, moral fanatics, or political threats. The answer changed depending on time, place, governor, emperor, rumor, and local tension. That inconsistency would shape the persecutions that followed. Christianity was not hunted with equal force in every corner of the empire from the beginning. The danger rose and fell. A community might live quietly for years, then suddenly face denunciation. A governor might prefer not to seek Christians out, but punish them if formally accused. A crowd might demand action after some disaster. An emperor might see unity slipping and decide that religious nonconformity was no longer tolerable. Fear does not need to be constant to be effective. It only needs to return often enough that people remember it. For Christians, that fear became part of their identity. They learned that the empire could misunderstand them, mock them, accuse them, and demand gestures they could not give. They also learned that refusal had consequences. For Rome, the Christians posed a different lesson. A person who will not sacrifice even to save his life is difficult to govern by ordinary means. The empire had mastered obedience through law, honor, punishment, and reward. But Christianity introduced a kind of resistance that did not look like rebellion from the outside. It did not always shout. It did not always flee. Sometimes it simply stood still and said no. And in a world where the gods, the city, and the emperor were woven together, that single word could sound like a crack running through the foundations. Chapter 7. Blood in the Arena, Memory in the Church. The Roman persecution of Christians was not a single storm that began one day and ended centuries later. That is the picture people sometimes carry. A continuous age of believers dragged endlessly into arenas, while every emperor from the beginning behaves like a villain in the same play. It is dramatic. It is simple. It is also misleading. The reality was more uneven, and in some ways more frightening because of it. Persecution came in waves. It depended on place, politics, local hostility, imperial priorities, and the mood of officials. Some Christian communities lived for long periods without direct violence. Others faced interrogation, imprisonment, confiscation, exile, or execution. A believer in one city might worship quietly while another, in a different province, was denounced before a governor. The danger was not always everywhere, but it was never impossible. That uncertainty shaped Christian memory. A community did not need to see executions every week to know that the empire could demand a test of loyalty. The threat lived in the background, like a door that might open without warning. When violence came, it was public for a reason. Rome understood spectacle. Punishment was not only about removing a person from society, it was about teaching society what power looked like. The arena, the tribunal, the crowd, the formal question, the demand to sacrifice, these were not random details. They turned law into theater. A Christian brought before authority might be asked to perform a simple act, offer sacrifice, honor the gods, acknowledge the emperor's sacred order. To many Romans, this was not an unreasonable request. It was a gesture, a small public action, a way back into civic peace. But to the Christian who believed such an act betrayed God, the gesture was not small at all. This is where the drama of martyrdom emerged. The word martyr originally means witness, and that meaning matters. The martyr was not remembered merely as a victim. The martyr was remembered as someone who testified, through suffering and death, that another kingdom stood above Rome's claims. The execution, meant to display Roman authority, became, in Christian retelling, evidence of spiritual victory. That reversal was powerful. Rome staged punishment to create fear. The Church preserved the story to create courage. We should be careful here. Martyr stories were often written, copied, shaped, and retold within communities that already revered the dead. Some accounts are historically stronger than others. Some may contain literary embellishment, stylized speeches, or details that grew in the telling. The legend could become larger than the event itself. But the importance of martyrdom does not depend on every later detail being exact. What matters is that Christians learned to interpret suffering in a way Rome did not intend. Pain became testimony. Defeat became imitation of Christ. Death became a doorway rather than a final humiliation. That did not make Christians eager for suffering in every case. The evidence is more complicated. Some believers fled. Some hid. Some compromised. Some denied the faith under pressure and later sought restoration. Church leaders argued over how to treat those who had failed during persecution. These arguments could be fierce because persecution did not only create heroes, it created wounds inside the community. What should be done with someone who sacrificed under fear? Could they return? Who had authority to forgive? Was the church a hospital for the broken, or a pure body guarded by the brave? These questions reveal something more human than polished martyr legends. Under persecution, communities were forced to define themselves, not only against Rome, but within their own conscience. The martyr became the ideal. The lapsed became the problem. And between them stood the difficult reality of fear. For Rome, execution was supposed to settle the matter. For Christians, the memory of execution could keep the matter alive for generations. A governor might see one condemned person. A church might see a feast day, a story, a tomb, a name spoken in prayer, a model for children, a proof that faith could outlast the body. Memory was the church's counter-spectacle. It took what happened in public and carried it into worship. It turned the shame of death into honor. It gathered around graves. It retold final words, acts of courage, moments of refusal. It did not always do so with the restraint of a modern historian, but it did so with the intensity of people trying to survive. This gave scattered communities a shared emotional language. A Christian in North Africa could hear of suffering elsewhere and feel connected. A believer in Asia Minor could recognize the same pattern of accusation, trial, pressure, and refusal. The martyrs became more than local dead. They became signs that the whole movement was caught in a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, life and death, Christ and the powers of the world. That interpretation strengthened identity. It also unsettled Roman expectations. The empire could punish bodies, but it had less control over the meaning assigned to those punishments. If a public execution made spectators pity the condemned or admire their courage, the message became unstable. If a death meant to shame a movement instead inspired new converts, punishment began to fail as propaganda. This does not mean persecution was secretly good for Christians in some simple way. Suffering destroys. Families grieved. Communities were traumatized. Leaders were lost. Books and property could be seized. Fear could silence people. We should not turn real pain into a neat strategy for church growth. But history often moves through unintended consequences. The Roman state wanted conformity. Persecution sometimes produced clarity. A believer who watched someone refuse sacrifice under threat could no longer treat faith as a casual preference. The stakes had been revealed. The community's claims about resurrection, judgment, and eternal life were no longer only teachings spoken in a room. They had been tested in the body of a witness. The arena was designed to make Rome look eternal. Martyr memory made Rome look temporary. That is the deeper transformation. In the public space of imperial power, Christians learned to tell a different story about who was truly victorious. The magistrate had authority for a day. The crowd had noise for an hour. The executioner had force in the moment. But the martyr, in Christian memory, possessed a future Rome could not grant or revoke. This was not a military victory. It was a victory over interpretation, and empires depend on interpretation more than they admit. They need people to believe that their punishments mean justice, that their rituals mean order, that their titles mean legitimacy, that their violence means inevitability. When a persecuted community can look at the same scene and see not defeat, but witness, imperial power loses some of its spell. The Christians were still vulnerable. They could still be arrested. They could still killed. They could still be mocked by neighbors who considered their stubbornness foolish or antisocial. But they had learned how to remember. And memory is a dangerous thing when it refuses to obey the empire's script. The blood spilled in courts, prisons, and arenas did not drown the movement. In Christian imagination, it marked the ground. It told later believers that Rome might command the body, but it could not own the soul. It gave the church a gallery of witnesses whose courage made ordinary compromise harder to justify. The empire had the spectacle. The church kept the story. And over time, the story traveled farther than the spectacle ever could. Chapter 8. The crisis beneath the marble. From a distance, Rome could look unbreakable. That was part of the illusion it worked so hard to maintain. Marble temples, triumphal arches, military standards, disciplined roads, imperial portraits staring out from coins. All of it told the same story. Rome endured. Rome commanded. Rome gave order to the world. But empires are rarely as solid as their monuments. By the 3rd century, cracks were spreading beneath the polished surface. Some were political, some were military, some were economic, some were harder to name, belonging to that uneasy region where public fear becomes spiritual anxiety. The empire did not collapse all at once. That is another tempting simplification. People still married, traded, farmed, argued, worshipped, paid rent, wrote letters, bribed officials, raised children, and complained about prices as people always do. Life continued, but it continued under growing strain. The throne itself became unstable. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Armies proclaimed their own candidates. Generals fought one another for control. Civil wars drained attention and resources. The imperial office, which had once wrapped itself in an aura of majesty, began to look dangerously dependent on military loyalty. When soldiers could make an emperor, they could also unmake one. That was not just a political problem. It was a psychological one. The emperor was supposed to represent order. If the emperor changed constantly, if legitimacy could be decided by force, if the man who appeared on coins this year might be murdered by next year, then the whole symbolic structure of power became less convincing. The face on the coin still looked calm. The world behind it did not. At the borders, pressure mounted. Rome faced enemies and rivals on multiple fronts. Germanic groups pressed in the north. The Persian power in the east posed a serious challenge. Frontier defense required money, manpower, and competent leadership. When the center was distracted by internal struggles, the edges felt the danger first. Raids, defeats, and military emergencies reminded people that Rome's protection was not automatic. The empire had always sold security. Now security felt less certain. Then came disease. Plagues in the Roman world did more than kill. They unsettled the moral imagination. When death enters a city in waves, it exposes how fragile every institution really is. Temples may still stand, but priests die. Governors may still issue orders, but households empty. Markets continue until fear interrupts them. Bodies need burial. Families need explanation. Someone has to make sense of the invisible enemy moving through streets and rooms. Ancient people did not have modern germ theory. They interpreted disaster through the languages available to them. Divine anger, fate, pollution, imbalance, judgment, bad air, bad luck, bad rulers. In such a world, religious questions were not separate from public crisis. They were part of how crisis was understood. If the gods protected Rome, why did Rome suffer? There was no single answer, and different communities gave different explanations. Traditional worship did not disappear. Many people remained loyal to older cults, local gods, and ancestral practices. We should not imagine the empire suddenly becoming spiritually empty, waiting passively for Christianity to arrive. That would be too neat, and history is almost never that courteous. But old certainties were under pressure. Inflation and taxation added another layer of unease. Armies had to be paid. Administrations had to function. Coinage changed. Prices shifted. Rural populations felt burdens that could be difficult to escape. In some places, local elites who had once taken pride in public benefaction faced heavier obligations. The civic culture that had held Roman urban life together began to strain under the cost of survival. A city could still host games. A wealthy man could still sponsor a building. A temple festival could still fill the streets. But beneath the rituals of continuity, many people sensed that the world was becoming harder to trust. This is where Christianity's growth must be placed carefully. It did not succeed simply because Rome was collapsing. That would be too crude. Christianity had already been spreading before the deepest imperial crises. Its communities, letters, disciplines, and networks were already in motion. The faith was not created by fear. But fear changed the air it moved through. A stable world can make inherited religion feel natural. You do what your parents did. You honor the gods of your city. You sacrifice because everyone sacrifices. You trust the civic rituals because the city still stands. The harvest comes. The army protects. And the emperor, however distant, seems part of the order of things. A shaken world invites harder questions. What deserves loyalty when rulers fail? What kind of hope survives plague? What is a human life worth when markets break and armies march? Who sees the poor when public honor belongs to the rich? What if the gods who receive sacrifice do not answer in the way people need? Christianity did not offer easy comfort. In many ways, it offered a demanding life, filled with moral restrictions, communal obligations, and the possibility of persecution. But it did offer a coherent story. It said suffering was not meaningless. It said death was not sovereign. It said earthly empires were temporary. It said the weak were not forgotten. It said history itself had a direction known to God. In an age of instability, coherence can be as valuable as bread. Not instead of bread. No one eats an idea. But people can endure hunger, sickness, and grief differently if they believe those experiences belong to a larger truth. Christianity gave its followers a vocabulary for catastrophe. Plague could be faced as a test of love. Poverty could be met through mutual aid. Death could be mourned without being treated as final. Political chaos could be interpreted as proof that no empire, however grand, should be worshipped as eternal. That message did not convince everyone. It did not need to. Movements grow when their interpretation of reality begins to match what enough people are already feeling. And by the 3rd century, many inhabitants of the empire had reason to feel that the official story was incomplete. Rome still possessed armies, laws, administrators, and wealth. It could still be terrifying. It could still recover. But the old confidence had been wounded. The marble remained. The certainty beneath it had begun to shift. And in that gap between imperial appearance and human fear, Christianity found more than converts. It found listeners already prepared to hear that the world they knew was not the final world, and that the power that seemed greatest was not necessarily the power that would last. Chapter 9. A religion for the age of fear. Fear changes what people are willing to hear. In an age of confidence, a religion of suffering may seem unnecessary, even unattractive. If the city is prosperous, the gods are honored, the borders are secure, the dead are buried with proper ceremony, and the emperor's image still feels like a promise of order, then a message centered on a crucified man may sound like an offense to common sense. But when the world becomes uncertain, the meaning of that message changes. The cross no longer looks only like defeat. It begins to look like recognition. Christianity spoke directly to people living under the weight of pain, death, and displacement. Not because Christians had never feared these things, they feared them deeply. Their writings are not the words of people untouched by grief. They are filled with anxiety, warning, longing, correction, endurance, and hope. But they offered a way to carry fear without allowing fear to become the final truth. That was powerful in a world where so much felt fragile. The Roman civic religion could be beautiful, ancient, and socially binding. It gave communities rituals, festivals, memories, and public identity. It tied the living to ancestors and the city to divine protection. For many people, it remained meaningful. We should not dismiss it as empty theater. That would be unfair to the millions who lived inside it sincerely. But it was not always designed to answer the private wound. What does a mother do with the death of a child? What does a slave do with humiliation? What does a migrant do with loneliness in a city that knows his labor but not his name? What does a sick person do when the household begins to fear his breath? Traditional religion could offer rituals and appeals to divine help. Philosophers could offer discipline of the mind, arguments about fate, virtue, and the soul. Mystery cults could offer initiation and hope. The Roman world was not spiritually barren. Christianity entered this crowded field with a story that was unusually intimate and unusually vast. It said that the God above all powers had entered human suffering. It said that humiliation was not proof of abandonment. It said that the innocent could suffer and still be vindicated. It said that death had been breached, not as a metaphor only, but as the central claim of the faith. It said that the poor, the grieving, the enslaved, the socially minor, and the morally broken were not accidents in the empire's machinery. They were seen. This did not make Christianity gentle in every respect. Its message could be severe. It spoke of judgment. It demanded repentance. It condemned idols and sins. It divided households. It asked converts to reorder loyalties that had once seemed natural. A person who joined the movement might gain a community and lose a family's trust. Hope came with cost, but costly hope can feel more serious than easy consolation. Christianity did not say, "Nothing is wrong." It said something far more durable. Something is wrong, and God has not abandoned the world to it. And that distinction matters. In times of crisis, people do not always want reassurance that their fear is imaginary. They know it is not. Plague is real. Hunger is real. Political violence is real. Death is real. The Christian message did not require believers to pretend otherwise. It placed those realities inside a larger cosmic conflict in which suffering could be endured, resisted, and finally overcome. For some converts, this must have given daily life a sharper meaning. A small act of charity was no longer just kindness. It was participation in the will of God. Refusing sacrifice was no longer mere stubbornness. It was fidelity to the truth. Caring for the sick was not only neighborly duty, it was imitation of Christ. Burial of the poor was not social housekeeping. It was a declaration that the body mattered and the dead were not disposable. The faith turned ordinary acts into eternal gestures. That is how a religion becomes livable. Not only by explaining the stars, the empire, or the end of the age, but by telling a person what to do tomorrow morning. Visit the widow. Bring food. Pray. Resist temptation. Forgive the one who wronged you, though perhaps not without a private struggle first. Gather with others. Remember the dead. Teach the child. Endure insult. Do not despair. In this sense, Christianity's strength was not only its doctrine of the afterlife, though that mattered enormously. Its strength was that the future hope changed present behavior. Resurrection was not simply a distant promise. It reorganized the meaning of the body, the community, and the moral life. Death still hurt, but it no longer owned the whole story. This gave Christians a strange confidence in the face of public catastrophe. During epidemics, some Christian communities became known for care, though we should be cautious about imagining every believer as heroic or every pagan as selfish. Reality was uneven. Fear makes cowards of many people, Christians included. Yet a community already trained to see service as sacred had a reason to remain when others fled. And even when they failed, the ideal remained. That ideal had persuasive force because it met the emotional needs of the age without pretending those needs were small. The empire could promise stability, but its promises had begun to look vulnerable. Christianity promised something different. Not that history would be painless, but that history was held within the purposes of God. That message could travel across class lines. To the poor, it offered dignity without requiring public honor. To some elites, it offered moral seriousness and a vision of order deeper than imperial ambition. To women, it could offer spiritual significance and community, even while Christian communities still reflected many patriarchal assumptions of their world. To slaves, it offered a divine identity Rome's law did not grant, though the Church's relationship to slavery remained morally complicated and far from a simple liberation story. The appeal was not identical for everyone. That is important. There was no single type of convert. Some were drawn by hope of resurrection, some by the moral discipline, some by healing, charity, intellectual conviction, family ties, admiration for martyrs, dissatisfaction with old rituals, or the persuasive force of a community that seemed to live differently. Conversion is rarely one cause wearing a clean label. It is usually a knot of longing, pressure, encounter, and belief. Christianity's genius was that it could speak to many of these longings at once. It offered a cosmic explanation for pain without making pain meaningless. It offered a community without requiring noble birth. It offered discipline in a chaotic world. It offered forgiveness in a world where shame could be socially permanent. It offered a future in which the victims of history were not simply erased. And it did all of this while carrying the image of the crucified Christ at its center. That image was not decorative. It was the argument. Rome displayed the cross as a warning. Power can reduce you to nothing. Christianity answered, God can meet a person even there. For an age of fear, that answer was not weak. It was astonishingly bold. It told believers that the worst Rome could do had already been taken into the heart of their faith and transformed. Execution, shame, bodily suffering, abandonment, death. These were not outside the Christian story. They were the very place where the story turned toward hope. That is why the movement could endure anxiety without being consumed by it. It did not need the empire to look eternal. In fact, Christianity made more sense when the empire did not. Chapter 10. The Great Persecution and the Failure of Terror. By the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a rumor moving quietly through rented rooms. It was still a minority movement, but not a negligible one. It had bishops, buildings, property, scriptures, networks of authority, and communities spread across the empire. It had survived suspicion, local violence, imperial hostility, and internal conflict. It had become visible enough that ignoring it was no longer the easiest option. For an emperor concerned with unity, that visibility mattered. Diocletian was not a fool thrashing blindly at a faith he did not understand. He was one of the most serious reforming emperors Rome produced in a time of deep strain. He tried to stabilize an empire battered by political chaos, military pressure, and administrative weakness. He reorganized power. He strengthened imperial ceremony. He sought order where the 3rd century had produced confusion. That is what makes the Great Persecution so important. It was not merely a fit of cruelty. It was part of a larger imperial dream. Restore unity. Restore discipline. Restore the favor of the gods. Restore the old structure of obedience. Christianity stood in the way. Not because Christians were preparing a military uprising, they were not. The problem was deeper and, from Rome's perspective, more frustrating. Christians refused the ritual gestures that symbolized shared loyalty. They would not fit neatly into the sacred architecture of the empire. Their god could not be placed politely beside Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, or the divine aura of imperial power. A state seeking visible unity found itself facing communities whose loyalty was sincere but divided by a higher allegiance. So terror was given a legal shape. Beginning in 303, imperial orders targeted the church with unusual seriousness. Christian scriptures were to be surrendered and destroyed. Meeting places could be demolished. Property could be confiscated. Clergy could be arrested. Sacrifice became a test. In some regions, imprisonment, torture, and execution followed. The exact intensity varied across the empire, because imperial policy always had to pass through local officials, local pressures, and local degrees of enthusiasm. But the message was unmistakable. The church was to be broken as an institution. This is an important shift. Earlier persecutions often depended heavily on local accusation or specific moments of crisis. The Great Persecution aimed more deliberately at Christian infrastructure. It did not only punish individual stubbornness, it attacked the things that allowed Christian memory and discipline to continue. Books, buildings, leaders, assemblies, property. Destroy the scriptures, and you damage the community's voice. Seize the buildings, and you interrupt its gatherings. Arrest the bishops, and you strike at its organization. Force sacrifice, and you divide believers from one another. The policy understood something real about Christianity. It recognized that the movement was not simply a collection of private opinions. It was embodied in texts, leaders, habits, and communal spaces. Diocletian's government saw the structure more clearly than some earlier authorities had, but seeing the structure was not the same as knowing how to destroy it. A book can be burned, but not every copy can be found. A leader can be imprisoned, but authority can pass through memory, letters, and local loyalty. A building can be confiscated, but a community that once met in homes can learn to meet without grandeur again. A forced sacrifice can expose fear, but it can also create new martyrs, new stories, and new arguments about repentance. The Great Persecution produced all of this. It produced courage, but also compromise. Some Christians surrendered scriptures or sacred objects. Some denied the faith. Some sacrificed under pressure. Others refused and suffered. The aftermath would leave bitter disputes, especially over how to treat those accused of betraying the community during the crisis. Terror did not simply create heroes, it created moral wreckage. That is how terror often works. It does not only kill bodies, it tries to make people ashamed of surviving. For Rome, this was useful. A divided church would be easier to weaken. If Christians argued over who had remained faithful and who had failed, the movement might consume itself from within. And in some places, those wounds lasted. The persecution left scars that did not disappear when the violence stopped. Yet the larger imperial goal failed. Christianity did not vanish. The reason was not that persecution was harmless. It was brutal. Families were damaged. Communities were frightened. Some leaders were lost. Texts were destroyed. Public worship was disrupted. The state could inflict tremendous suffering, and it did. But by this stage, Christianity was too deeply rooted to be erased by decree. It had already spread across too many cities and households. Its scriptures existed in too many copies. Its rituals could be practiced in humble spaces. Its leaders were important. But the faith did not depend on one fragile chain of command. Its members were trained to understand suffering as part of their story, not as proof that the story had failed. That last point is crucial. Rome was using pain as an argument. The church already had an answer to pain. A believer brought before authorities might still be terrified. We should not imagine calm faces everywhere, untouched by human fear. But Christian teaching had spent generations preparing people to see suffering through the memory of Christ and the martyrs. The empire could threaten death. The church preached resurrection. The empire could threaten shame. The church remembered a crucified Lord. The empire could seize property. The church taught that earthly things were temporary. This did not make Christians invincible. It made them difficult to intimidate completely. And that is a different kind of strength. The Great Persecution also revealed a practical limit of Roman power. The empire could command sacrifice, but it could not easily command belief. It could force a gesture, but the gesture might produce resentment instead of loyalty. It could destroy a church building, but not the relationships that made the church a living body. It could demand unity, but the demand itself exposed how fragile unity had become. A confident empire does not need every dissenter to prove loyalty in public. An anxious empire does. Diocletian's campaign was meant to restore the sacred order of Rome. Instead, it helped show that the old order could no longer absorb everyone. The Christian refusal was not a small local irritation now. It was an empire-wide problem, and the attempt to solve it by force made the problem visible to all. The persecution ended unevenly, and not because Rome suddenly learned tolerance as a moral principle. Politics changed. Emperors changed. Priorities changed. The machinery of repression lost momentum. In the eastern regions, suffering continued longer than in some western areas. The story does not turn cleanly from darkness to light in a single moment. But the failure was clear enough. After years of pressure, confiscation, imprisonment, and death, Christians remained. Not as a hidden memory, as a public fact. This was the great irony of the Great Persecution. It was the most systematic attempt to crush Christianity, and it became the last great proof that crushing it was no longer realistic. The empire had tried to force the movement back into fear, but the movement had learned to live with fear. Rome had tried to erase Christian memory, but martyr memory grew sharper. Rome had tried to break organization, but the church's networks bent rather than disappeared. Terror can silence a room. It cannot always silence a world. By the time Diocletian left power and new contenders struggled for control, Christianity had survived the harshest imperial assault it had yet faced. It had been wounded, divided, and tested, but it had not been destroyed. And that survival changed the political imagination. If the church could not be eliminated, perhaps it could be used. If Christian loyalty could not be forced through sacrifice, perhaps it could be redirected through favor. If the old methods had failed, a new ruler might see in Christianity not only a problem, but an opportunity. The next turn in the story would come not from a bishop, a martyr, or a hidden gathering, but from a soldier emperor moving toward a decisive battle outside Rome. Chapter 11. Constantine's Vision and the Political Earthquake. Constantine did not enter history as a saint walking out of stained glass. He was a soldier, a political survivor, and a claimant in a violent imperial contest. He knew the language of command before he knew the language of Christian theology. He understood loyalty, risk, propaganda, timing, and the value of symbols. If we want to understand why his turn toward Christianity mattered, we have to resist the temptation to make him either too pure or too cynical. He was neither a simple hero nor a simple fraud. He was an emperor in the making, standing in a world where power had become unstable and legitimacy had to be fought for. After Diocletian's reforms, the empire had been divided among multiple rulers in an attempt to prevent the chaos of endless succession struggles. In theory, this system was meant to bring order. In practice, ambition remained ambition. Men with armies rarely enjoy being told where their ceiling is. The imperial system cracked under rivalry, bloodline claims, military loyalty, and suspicion. Constantine was part of that world. He rose in the Western Empire, inheriting not only troops and political opportunity, but also a moment when the old order was uncertain. The Great Persecution had shown that Christianity could not be crushed easily. The imperial college was fractured. Rome itself, though still symbolically immense, was no longer the unquestioned center of power it had once seemed. In such a world, victory required more than winning a battle. It required explaining why that victory was legitimate. Then came the road to the Milvian Bridge. In 312, Constantine moved against Maxentius, his rival in Italy. The battle took place near Rome, at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber. Militarily, it was decisive. Politically, it was explosive. But the event became more than a battle because of the story Constantine attached to it. According to later Christian accounts, Constantine experienced a sign before the battle. The details vary depending on the source. Some versions describe a vision in the sky. Others speak of a dream instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol. The famous phrase often associated with the event, "In this sign conquer," belongs to the later traditions surrounding the story. The evidence must be handled with care, because imperial memory is never innocent. Victors know how to frame the past. Still, what matters historically is not only what Constantine saw, it is what he chose to do with what he believed or claimed he had seen. The Christian sign became attached to imperial victory. That was the earthquake. For generations, Christians had been suspected because they would not properly honor the gods of the empire. They had been accused of weakening public religion, refusing sacrifice, and endangering Rome's relationship with divine powers. Now a victorious emperor associated his success with the God of the Christians. The reversal was astonishing. The faith once treated as a threat to imperial order was suddenly linked to imperial triumph. This did not mean Constantine instantly became a modern Christian ruler in the way later imagination sometimes presents him. His religious life appears gradual, complex, and politically entangled. He continued to operate within an imperial culture where symbols, titles, and public messaging mattered deeply. He did not dismantle the Roman world overnight. He did not erase all older practices with a single command, and his baptism, according to later tradition, came only near the end of his life. But after 312, the direction of travel had changed. Christianity was no longer merely a tolerated inconvenience waiting for the next wave of suspicion. It had caught the attention of power at the highest level. More than that, it had entered the symbolic vocabulary of victory. For the Church, this was both deliverance and danger. Deliverance, because imperial hostility could now give way to protection. Confiscated properties might be restored. Christian leaders could emerge more openly. Public worship could become safer. The old fear did not disappear everywhere at once, but the atmosphere changed. Danger, because favor can transform a movement as deeply as persecution. A church shaped by martyr memory now had to deal with imperial patronage. Bishops who had once risked arrest could find themselves invited into the world of court politics. The faith that had grown in homes, cemeteries, and modest meeting places was about to receive money, buildings, privileges, and attention from rulers who had their own reasons for caring about unity. The cross had survived terror. Now it would have to survive success. That may sound strange, but success often asks questions suffering does not. Under persecution, the line can seem clear. Refuse the sacrifice, remain faithful, endure. Under imperial favor, the questions become more subtle. How close should the church stand to power? Can an emperor protect the faith without trying to control it? Can bishops accept patronage without becoming ornaments of the state? Can a religion built around a crucified man sit comfortably beside a throne? These questions did not all appear at once, but the seeds were there from the beginning. Constantine saw in Christianity something valuable for an empire hungry for unity. The church possessed organization. It possessed moral seriousness. It possessed translocal networks. It possessed leaders who could speak across regions. It possessed a God who was not tied to one city or one ethnic tradition. In a fragmented imperial world, this universal quality was politically useful. That does not mean Constantine's interest was only political. Human motives are rarely so clean. He may sincerely have believed that the Christian God had favored him. He may have seen his victory as proof of divine backing. He may also have recognized that supporting Christianity could strengthen his rule. Faith and calculation can live in the same person without politely taking turns. This is what makes Constantine so fascinating. He did not conquer Christianity as an enemy. He embraced it as a source of legitimacy, and in doing so changed both the empire and the church. At the Milvian Bridge, Maxentius was defeated. But the deeper defeat belonged to an older assumption, that Rome's sacred order could remain securely pagan while Christianity stayed at the margins. After Constantine's victory, that assumption could no longer hold. The empire had tried exclusion. It had tried suspicion. It had tried terror. Now, through Constantine, it tried favor, and favor would prove to be one of the most powerful forces Christianity had ever encountered. Not because it erased the past, but because it opened doors that had once been sealed by fear. The persecuted movement could now stand in public light. Its leaders could speak near power. Its buildings could rise. Its disputes could become imperial concerns. Its God could be invoked not only by prisoners and widows, but by the man who claimed to rule the Roman world. The political earthquake was not that Constantine made Christianity official. That would come later, under different circumstances and different rulers. The earthquake was that an emperor looked at the faith of the crucified man and saw victory. Chapter 12. The Edict that Changed the Empire. In 313, Christianity did not become the official religion of the Roman Empire. That misunderstanding is so common that it almost becomes part of the legend. The story is often compressed into a simple sequence. Christians were persecuted. Constantine won a battle. And suddenly the empire became Christian. It is clean, memorable, and wrong. What happened was more careful, and in some ways more important. The agreement, usually called the Edict of Milan, did not crown Christianity over the empire. It granted legal toleration. It allowed Christians, and others as well, to worship without fear of official punishment. It ordered the restoration of confiscated Christian property. It gave the church public legitimacy after the trauma of the Great Persecution. That was revolutionary enough. For Christians who had lived through raids, arrests, burned scriptures, demolished meeting places, and forced sacrifice. Legal toleration was not a minor administrative adjustment. It changed the air. A gathering that had once carried the memory of danger could now step toward the open. A bishop who had once negotiated survival could begin negotiating property. A community that had seen its sacred books seized could now ask the state to return what had been taken. This is where law becomes atmosphere. The words of an imperial order may look dry on a page, but for the people living under it, law can alter the texture of daily life. It decides whether a door opens quietly or openly, whether a meeting is vulnerable to denunciation, whether a cemetery, a house church, or a building belongs to the community or to the state, whether an official can treat Christian worship as a crime or must now recognize it as protected. The Edict of Milan did not make everyone kind. It did not erase suspicion from neighborhoods. It did not settle theological disputes. It did not convert the empire overnight. But it removed the formal shadow of illegality, and that mattered immensely. Constantine and Licinius, the rulers associated with the agreement, presented toleration in terms that suited imperial concerns. Religious peace was not only a gift to Christians, it was a policy for stability. If divine favor mattered to the empire, then allowing people to worship freely could be framed as a way of securing that favor. The old Roman instinct had not vanished. Religion still mattered because the empire's welfare mattered. The difference was that Christians were now included within the legal imagination of imperial peace. This was a dramatic reversal from Diocletian's campaign. Only a decade earlier, imperial policy had tried to break Christian organization by targeting texts, clergy, buildings, and property. Now the empire recognized the church's right to exist and ordered that property be returned. To the state, this may have been policy. To Christians, it must have felt like vindication. But vindication brought complications. Once property is restored, someone must decide who rightfully controls it. Once bishops receive imperial attention, rival bishops may appeal to imperial power. Once the church is publicly recognized, its internal conflicts become harder to keep internal. Legal toleration opened space for Christian life, but it also invited the empire closer to Christian disputes. That closeness would matter very soon. For now, though, we should pause on the meaning of toleration itself. In a modern context, toleration can sound modest, almost disappointing. We may think of it as mere permission. But after persecution, permission can be profound. It can mean no soldier at the door, no forced sacrifice, no official demand to surrender Scripture, no need to wonder whether a neighbor's accusation will become a death sentence. It can mean children growing up with a different horizon of fear. The Christian movement had survived as an unofficial, often vulnerable network. Now it could begin to build with confidence. Not everywhere at the same pace, not without conflict, not without the uneven realities of local politics. But the direction had shifted from survival toward institution. And institutions leave marks. Buildings could be repaired or constructed. Clergy could operate more openly. Public worship could expand. The church's social services, teaching, and disciplinary structures could become more visible. Christianity could move from the margins of legality toward the center of imperial attention. The danger was that center always has gravity. A persecuted church can define itself against power. A tolerated church must decide how to live near it. The old stories of martyrs did not disappear, but their meaning began to change. They were no longer only memories of resistance. They became part of the moral treasury of a church now receiving favor from the descendants of the same imperial world that had once condemned them. There is an irony here, and it is sharp. The empire that had seized Christian property now restored it. The power that had demanded sacrifice now protected the refusal to sacrifice. The legal order that had made Christians vulnerable now gave them standing. For many believers, this may have looked like the hand of God moving through history. For a cautious historian, it also looks like politics adapting to reality. Christianity had survived the effort to destroy it. Constantine had discovered that alliance could succeed where repression had failed. The church, for its part, had become too organized, too widespread, and too morally confident to be treated forever as a passing superstition. The Edict of Milan changed the empire because it changed Christianity's public position. It did not end paganism. It did not erase old rituals. It did not create a Christian state. Temples still stood. Traditional cults still functioned. Many people across the empire remained attached to ancestral worship. The Roman world was far too large and varied to turn in a single motion. But after 313, Christianity no longer had to exist as an illegal question mark. It had a recognized place. And once a movement has legal space, property, leadership, and imperial attention, it can become something far more durable than a persecuted sect. It can become a public institution with memory, buildings, hierarchy, disputes, wealth, ambition, charity, and influence. This is why the edict matters so deeply. Not because it completed the Christianization of Rome, but because it made that future imaginable. Before it, Christians could survive the empire. After it, Christians could begin to shape the empire. And somewhere in that transition, the faith of the crucified man crossed a threshold from endurance into power. Chapter 13. from catacombs to councils. Once Christianity became legal, it could no longer remain exactly what it had been. That may sound obvious, but it is easy to miss the scale of the transformation. A persecuted movement does not simply step into public favor and continue unchanged. The rooms become larger, the leaders become more visible, the disputes become louder. Money enters, architecture enters, imperial attention enters, and with attention comes pressure. For generations, Christians had gathered wherever they could: homes, modest halls, cemeteries, adapted spaces, places shaped more by necessity than grandeur. The popular image of the catacombs can be misleading if we imagine the entire early church living permanently underground like a secret civilization. Catacombs were burial places, and they mattered deeply. But Christianity was never only a faith of tunnels and hidden chambers. Still, the contrast is useful. Before Constantine, Christian space was often vulnerable. After Constantine, Christian space could become monumental. Basilicas began to rise. This choice of building form mattered. The basilica was not originally a Christian invention. It was a Roman public building type, used for civic and legal purposes. By adapting it for worship, Christians did something quietly brilliant. They did not simply imitate pagan temples. They took a form associated with public assembly and authority, then filled it with Christian meaning. The result was more than shelter. A basilica changed how Christianity looked to the world. It gave the faith a public body. It made the community visible in stone, timber, lamps, columns, courtyards, and processions. A movement once accused of secrecy now occupied spaces that could not be ignored. But buildings do not only express belief, they shape it. A gathering in a house has one kind of intimacy. A congregation beneath a high roof, moving through ordered space toward an altar, has another. Scale changes posture. It changes sound. It changes what leadership feels like. The bishop, already important before Constantine, now stood in a world where his office could carry public weight. The bishop became not only a teacher and guardian of doctrine, but also an administrator, judge, patron, negotiator, and representative of the Christian community before imperial power. Some bishops were pious and capable. Some were ambitious. Many were both, because human beings rarely divide themselves into clean moral categories for the convenience of later historians. Imperial patronage intensified everything. When emperors gave money, land, privileges, or attention, they strengthened the church. They also pulled it into the orbit of political expectation. The state wanted unity. The church wanted truth. Those goals could support each other, but they were not identical. Unity asks, can the empire hold together? Truth asks, what must be confessed, even if unity breaks? The collision between those questions became unavoidable. Christianity had always argued about meaning. The New Testament itself preserves disputes over law, food, authority, resurrection, ethics, and community life. The early church was never a perfectly calm family portrait. Legal toleration did not create disagreement. It gave disagreement a larger stage. The most famous of these disputes centered on the relationship between Christ and God the Father. The controversy associated with Arius, a priest from Alexandria, was not a minor quarrel over wording, though to outsiders it may have looked like one. It touched the deepest question of Christian worship. Who exactly is Christ? created or eternal, divine in the highest sense, or exalted but somehow lesser than the Father. How could Christians worship Christ while insisting there is only one God? These were not academic puzzles for people with too much time indoors. They mattered because worship depended on them. Salvation depended on them. Prayer depended on them. The entire Christian reading of Jesus' death and resurrection depended on who Christians believed Jesus truly was. Constantine, concerned with religious unity as part of imperial stability, convened the Council of Nicaea in 325. Here the story becomes especially revealing. An emperor, once unimaginable as a patron of the persecuted church, now called bishops together to settle a theological crisis. The empire was no longer merely watching Christianity, it was hosting its arguments. Nicaea did not make Constantine a theologian in the deepest sense. He was not suddenly a desert monk with a crown. His concern was partly political. Division inside the church threatened the unity he wanted for the empire. But the bishops did not gather merely to flatter imperial preference. They debated language, authority, scripture, and tradition. They struggled to define what could be said faithfully about the mystery at the center of their faith. The council produced a creed, condemning Arius's position and affirming that the Son was of the same divine essence as the Father. The later history of this conflict remained complicated, and the council did not end all controversy. In fact, arguments over Arianism and Nicene belief continued for decades, drawing in emperors, bishops, exiles, councils, and entire regions of the empire. That is one of the details people often misunderstand. Nicaea was not a magic switch that made Christian doctrine instantly settled everywhere. It was a landmark, not the end of the road. It gave powerful language to one side of a major dispute, but the struggle over that language continued long after the bishops left. Still, the symbolism was immense. The church that had once feared imperial summons now answered an imperial invitation. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea belonged to a religion that had survived illegality within living memory. Some may have carried the memory, even the physical scars, of persecution. Now they sat under the sponsorship of an emperor seeking Christian agreement for the sake of imperial order. No one could pretend the world had not changed, but change brought ambiguity. Was this the triumph of the church over empire, or the beginning of the empire's influence over the church? The honest answer is uncomfortable. It was both, depending on where one looks. Christianity gained protection, resources, and public strength. It could build, teach, organize, and argue with a confidence unknown during the worst persecutions. But the church also entered a relationship with power that would leave permanent marks. Imperial favor could defend orthodoxy, but it could also punish dissent. It could fund basilicas, but also reward bishops who aligned with court politics. It could seek unity, but sometimes confuse unity with control. The catacomb and the council chamber belong to the same story, but they formed very different Christians. One trained believers to endure danger, the other trained leaders to negotiate power. Neither world was pure. The persecuted church had its failures. The favored church had its saints. But the tension between them would haunt Christian history from this point forward. A faith born around a condemned man was learning to speak in the halls of authority. Its leaders had to decide how to use influence without losing the memory of the cross. That was not a small spiritual problem. It was the central problem of success. Rome had not destroyed Christianity. Instead, It had given Christianity buildings, status, and a place at the table. The movement that once spread through roads, ports, letters, homes, and graves was becoming an institution of public consequence. The invisible community had become visible, and visibility, like persecution, had its own test of faith. Chapter 14. The empire converts, but not all at once. The Roman Empire did not wake up one morning and discover it was Christian. That is the clean version, the mapmaker's version, the version that likes firm borders and bright colors. Before Constantine, pagan empire. After Constantine, Christian empire. A satisfying line drawn across history. But real conversion does not move like ink across parchment. It moves unevenly. Through families, through laws, through ambitions, through fear, through habit, through sincere belief and social advantage, through cities faster than villages, through elites in one way, ordinary people in another, through public ceremony long before private imagination has fully changed. The empire became Christian gradually, and not without resistance. After Constantine, Christian influence grew dramatically, but the old religious world remained alive. Temples still stood. Sacrifices still happened. Philosophers still defended ancestral traditions. Families still honored household customs. Rural communities continued practices tied to land, harvest, memory, and local identity. For many people, the gods of their ancestors were not abstractions to be discarded because an emperor had changed his favor. They were woven into the calendar, into the town, into the family, into the question of who they were. This is one reason the Christianization of Rome was never just a matter of doctrine defeating doctrine. It was a struggle over the habits of ordinary life. What happens to festivals when the gods they honor are condemned? What happens to public offices when rituals are built into civic duty? What happens to a city's identity when its oldest temples are no longer treated as guardians, but as errors? A law can forbid a sacrifice. It cannot instantly rewrite affection. And affection is one of history's most stubborn forces. Some pagans resisted Christianity intellectually. They argued that the old traditions had sustained Rome for centuries, and that abandoning them endangered the empire's relationship with the divine. Others objected socially, not because they wrote philosophical defenses of the gods, but because Christian moral discipline threatened familiar pleasures, customs, and public rhythms. Others were less ideological and more practical. If the emperor favored Christians, then becoming Christian might open doors. If a local aristocrat remained attached to traditional religion, then old loyalty might still be useful. Conversion could be sincere. It could also be strategic. Often, it was probably both. This is uncomfortable but necessary to say. When a religion moves from the margins to the center, motives become mixed. A poor convert seeking hope in the resurrection, a bishop seeking unity, a noble family seeking imperial favor, a town seeking protection from official pressure, and an emperor seeking divine backing may all enter the same church while carrying very different inner worlds. Christianity did not spread only because people were forced. It did not spread only because people were persuaded. It spread through a complicated meeting of conviction, community, power, policy, and historical timing. The elites mattered enormously. Roman aristocrats had long shaped public life through wealth, patronage, building projects, and office holding. When members of elite families converted, Christianity gained more than individual believers. It gained networks, estates, education, influence, and prestige. A faith that had once attracted suspicion as socially marginal could now be defended by people trained in rhetoric, administration, and law. But elite conversion also changed the church. The poor were not erased, but the sound of Christianity became more public, more literary, more institutional. Bishops corresponded with officials. Christian intellectuals argued with pagan critics using the language of classical education. Wealth funded basilicas, charities, monasteries, and memorial churches. The faith of fishermen and artisans now had patrons who could endow buildings and shape public taste. This was not simply corruption. Patronage built hospitals, supported the poor, sponsored art, copied books, and gave Christian teaching a durable public presence. But it also brought temptations familiar to every age: status disguised as piety, ambition dressed in theological language, and the quiet assumption that God must surely agree with the people who can afford marble. The movement from toleration to dominance accelerated under later emperors. Constantine opened the door. His successors argued, favored, reversed, pressured, and intervened in different ways. Some emperors supported forms of Christianity that later Nicene Christians considered heretical. Julian, later remembered as the apostate, attempted to revive traditional religion in the 4th century, showing that pagan resistance was not merely a fading echo. His reign was brief, but revealing. The Christian future was not yet so secure that no one could imagine turning back. That failed attempt matters because it reminds us that history was not inevitable to those living through it. People in the 4th century did not know they were characters in a story titled The Triumph of Christianity. They lived amid uncertainty. Imperial favor could shift. Theological factions could rise and fall. Bishops could be exiled and restored. Cities could divide over doctrine. Soldiers, monks, courtiers, philosophers, widows, and emperors all pushed history from different directions. By the late 4th century, imperial policy moved more decisively against traditional public cults. Christianity's position strengthened. Pagan sacrifice came under increasing restriction. Theodosius I, especially, is associated with laws that gave Nicene Christianity a dominant legal status and placed growing pressure on older forms of worship. But even then, the transformation was uneven. A law issued from the center had to travel across a vast empire of different languages, customs, and local powers. Enforcement varied. Some temples closed. Some were converted. Some decayed. Some remained as buildings stripped of older functions. Some communities adapted their public lives gradually, preserving social patterns under Christian names or Christian supervision. The countryside moved differently from the cities. The word pagan itself came to be associated with rural or traditional religious persistence, though its history is more complex than a simple insult meaning country person. What matters is the pattern. Urban centers with bishops, imperial officials, schools, trade, and public institutions often became Christianized in more visible ways before rural habits fully changed. Out in the villages, religion was tied to land, seasons, ancestors, and practical anxieties that did not vanish because a bishop preached against them. The empire converted, but memory lagged behind. That lag created tension. Christian leaders complained about lingering customs. Sermons attacked festivals, divination, amulets, sacrifices, and behaviors that suggested old religious assumptions had survived beneath new labels. These complaints are useful evidence, though not always in the way the authors intended. When a bishop keeps denouncing a practice, it usually means someone is still doing it. The Christian empire was therefore not a finished object. It was a struggle in progress. There were also regional differences. Christianity took root deeply in some eastern cities. North Africa produced powerful Christian communities and fierce internal disputes. Rome itself became a major Christian center, while still carrying the weight of its pagan monuments and aristocratic memory. The western provinces did not all move at the same pace. The empire was too large to tell one story from one city and pretend it applied everywhere. Even Christian unity was more fragile than the phrase Christian empire suggests. Theological conflict continued. Nicene Christians, Arians, Donatists, and other groups argued over doctrine, authority, sacraments, purity, and power. To say the empire became Christian does not mean Christians agreed on what Christianity required. In some cases, imperial support for one version of Christianity made other Christians feel persecuted by a state that now claimed to defend the faith. This is one of the great ironies of the conversion of Rome. A religion once punished for refusing imperial religious unity eventually became involved in enforcing its own forms of unity. The persecuted became protected. Then, in some cases, the protected became powerful enough to pressure others. This does not cancel the courage of earlier Christians. It does not make Constantine's shift meaningless. It does not reduce the entire story to hypocrisy. But it does warn us against telling triumphal history too smoothly. Victory changes the victor. The church that emerged from the age of imperial favor was not identical to the church that had gathered under threat. And Rome, too, was changed. Its language shifted. Its laws began to absorb Christian moral concerns. Its public calendar changed. Its buildings changed. Its concept of imperial duty changed. The emperor was no longer simply the guardian of the old gods and civic rights. Increasingly, he was expected to defend true religion, suppress error, patronize churches, and support bishops who could help hold society together. The empire had not merely accepted a new cult. It had begun to rethink sacred authority. That process was contested, incomplete, and often painful. It involved genuine faith and political calculation, charity and coercion, spiritual longing and institutional ambition. It moved through decrees, sermons, family decisions, local conflicts, and the slow death of habits that had once seemed permanent. Rome did not fall to Christianity like a city stormed by soldiers. It yielded unevenly, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes because the new faith answered old fears, and sometimes because power had changed its costume. The empire converted, but not all at once, and not without leaving fingerprints of the old world on the new one. Chapter 15. Victory without a legion. Rome knew how conquest was supposed to look. It had a grammar. First came pressure, then submission. A city opened its gates or saw them broken. A rival king bent the knee or was paraded in chains. A province was measured, taxed, garrisoned, and folded into the machinery of empire. Victory had sounds, marching feet, shouted orders, bronze on leather. The roar of crowds when captives passed beneath triumphal arches. Christianity did not arrive that way. There was no Christian legion at the gates of Rome in the first centuries. No campaign map with arrows moving westward. No battlefield where paganism surrendered its standards to bishops. The faith that reshaped the empire did so by methods Rome found harder to imagine as conquest because they did not look like force. It moved through networks. That may be the first key to the mystery. Christianity spread along the very connections Rome had built for its own purposes. Roads, sea routes, cities, letters, travelers, households, and diasporic communities. The empire created a connected world, and Christianity learned how to live inside that connectivity. A soldier might carry orders, a merchant might carry goods, a Christian traveler might carry a letter, a story, a name, a greeting, a teaching, a request for help. The movement was not fast in the modern sense. It was persistent. Persistence is often more important than speed. A message that can survive one generation of pressure and still be passed to the next has already defeated many forms of power. Christianity did not need every listener to convert. It needed enough communities to endure, reproduce, teach, and remain recognizable across distance. Its discipline mattered. The early churches were not loose circles of private spirituality. They formed habits. They taught moral behavior. They created leaders. They corrected members. They collected funds. They cared for the vulnerable. They argued over doctrine because doctrine mattered to identity. They developed rituals that marked entrance, belonging, forgiveness, memory, and hope. This gave Christianity institutional muscle long before it had imperial privilege. A purely emotional movement might flare and vanish. A purely intellectual school might remain the property of the educated. A purely ethnic religion might struggle to cross boundaries. Christianity became durable because it combined belief, practice, community, and organization. It could speak to the mind, the conscience, the body, and the household. That combination is rare. It also carried martyr memory. Rome could kill Christians, but it could not always control what their deaths meant. Public punishment was supposed to display imperial authority. Christian memory often transformed it into testimony. The martyr did not make the empire look merciful or eternal. The martyr made the empire look temporary, like a violent actor in a larger drama whose ending belonged to God. This did not make persecution harmless. It was not a clever recruitment strategy designed in advance. It broke families, frightened communities, and divided believers who failed under pressure from those who endured. But even the wounds became part of Christian self-understanding. The church remembered not only its teachers, but its dead. That memory gave the movement emotional depth. People do not easily abandon a community that has suffered for its truth, especially when the suffering is told as sacred witness. The martyrs gave later believers a standard, a warning, and a strange kind of confidence. If the empire's worst threat had already been faced by others, then the empire was fearsome, but not final. Then came the moral appeal. Christianity offered more than an argument against idols. It offered a way of life in which the poor, widows, orphans, prisoners, the sick, and the dead were bound into the obligations of the community. This was not charity in the modern institutional sense, and it was not always perfectly practiced. But it mattered because it made Christian belief visible in human care. Rome could dazzle. Christianity could belong. And belonging is one of the strongest forces in history. A person might admire the empire and still feel alone inside it. A person might benefit from Roman order and still fear disease, hunger, grief, shame, or death. Christianity entered those intimate spaces with a message that suffering was seen by God, that death did not have the last word, and that human value did not depend entirely on citizenship, wealth, gender, or public honor. Again, the Church did not fully escape the inequalities of its world. It carried many of them within itself, but it also placed them under judgment. The claim that all stood before one God did not instantly remake society, yet it introduced a pressure that Roman hierarchy could not entirely absorb. The empire's own crisis made that pressure stronger. When political instability, civil war, plague, inflation, and frontier dangers shook confidence in the old order, Christianity did not need to invent fear. Fear was already present. What it offered was interpretation. It told people that the empire was not ultimate. It explained suffering without requiring people to deny it. It offered hope without pretending the world was safe. That was why Christianity could sound persuasive in an age of uncertainty. It did not say Rome was nothing. Rome was plainly something, powerful, dangerous, magnificent, and often brutally effective. But Christianity said Rome was not everything. And once people believe that, imperial power loses a portion of its spell. The final key was political adoption. Without Constantine and the imperial favor that followed, Christianity's path would have looked very different. The faith had already spread before him, already developed institutions, already survived persecution. Constantine did not create Christianity's strength from nothing, but he recognized a strength that repression had failed to destroy, and he brought it into the realm of imperial power. That changed the scale. Legal toleration allowed public worship, restored property, and gave the church room to grow openly. Patronage built basilicas. Bishops gained influence. Councils drew theology into imperial concern. Later laws and emperors moved Christianity from favored religion toward dominance. This was not a smooth or instant conversion of the empire, but it was a decisive shift in the relationship between church and state. So why did Christianity win? Not because Rome was weak from the beginning. Not because Christians secretly commanded a hidden army. Not because one vision before one battle explains everything. It won because it became a network inside a network. It survived because it was organized enough to endure and flexible enough to travel. It attracted because it offered care, meaning, discipline, forgiveness, and hope. It strengthened under pressure because martyr memory turned terror into testimony. It expanded during crisis because its explanation of suffering matched the age's deepest fears. And finally, it rose into public power because emperors discovered that the movement they could not erase might help hold the empire together. That is the answer, but it is not a simple one. Christianity conquered Rome by becoming useful to ordinary people before it became useful to emperors. That may be the most important point. Imperial favor can amplify a religion, but it cannot easily create a living faith where none exists. By the time Constantine turned toward Christianity, the church already had roots in cities, households, cemeteries, texts, memory, and moral practice. Political adoption mattered because there was something real to adopt. The empire did not kneel before an idea that had remained small. It turned toward a movement that had already learned how to survive without permission. That is why the victory came without a legion. The conquest happened in loyalties, imaginations, habits, and hopes. It happened when people stopped assuming that Rome's gods, Rome's rituals, and Rome's power defined the limits of reality. It happened when the symbol of shame became a symbol of divine victory. It happened when the crucified man Rome had condemned became, for millions, the true Lord of history. Rome had mastered the art of taking territory. Christianity mastered the slower art of taking root. Chapter 16. The Cross over Rome. Rome had meant the cross to be the end of the story. That was its purpose. A cross did not merely kill, it announced. It turned the body into a warning and the condemned into a lesson. It told rebels, slaves, provincials, and dreamers that Rome possessed the final word over flesh, honor, and memory. But history did not obey the message Rome carved into the air. The man Rome executed did not disappear into the long list of the empire's dead. His followers remembered him differently. They preached him as risen. They carried his name along roads built for soldiers. They gathered in rooms too small for imperial notice. They buried their dead, fed their poor, argued over truth, and refused to offer the simple gestures that would have made their neighbors relax. For a long time, Rome saw them as a problem to classify, then as a danger to discipline, then as a movement too rooted to erase, and finally, under emperors who understood the uses of faith as well as the limits of force, Christianity moved from suspicion to favor, from favor to influence, and from influence toward dominance. The irony is almost too large to hold. The empire that crucified Jesus eventually carried the sign of the cross into its symbols, its laws, its buildings, its language of authority, and its imagination of power. Not instantly, not cleanly, not without compromise, conflict, coercion, or loss. The old Roman world did not vanish in a single breath. It lingered in habits, ceremonies, politics, architecture, and ambition. Even as the empire became Christian, Christianity became Roman in ways that would shape centuries to come. That is the uncomfortable truth beneath the triumph. Christianity changed Rome. Rome also changed Christianity. The faith of the margins gained basilicas, councils, imperial patrons, legal privilege, and public authority. It could protect, organize, teach, and build on a scale once unimaginable. But it also had to carry the burden of power. A religion centered on a crucified man now stood near emperors. A church that remembered martyrs now had to decide what to do with influence. The cross had conquered no territory by force, yet it had entered the machinery of rule. So the mystery resolves, but not into a simple victory chant. Christianity did not defeat Rome by becoming stronger in the Roman way. It did not outfight the legions or outspend the aristocracy. It survived in the places Rome underestimated. Memory, care, discipline, letters, hope, and the stubborn refusal of believers to let death define the limits of meaning. Then, when the empire itself grew anxious, fractured, and hungry for unity, the movement that had endured beneath its shadow became impossible to ignore. The greatest military empire of the ancient Mediterranean was reshaped by a faith that began with a public execution. That is not because history is sentimental, it is because power has more than one form. Rome could command bodies. Christianity claimed souls. Rome could build roads. Christianity traveled them. Rome could stage death. Christianity remembered it as witness. Rome could demand sacrifice. Christianity taught refusal. Rome could offer citizenship. Christianity offered belonging that crossed city, class, and border. And in the end, the empire discovered that an idea rooted in worship, community, and hope can move through the world without banners and still alter the fate of kings. The cross over Rome remains one of history's great reversals. A symbol designed for shame became a sign of divine victory. A condemned man became Lord in the language of millions. An empire that once tried to make his death forgettable became one of the main vessels through which his memory traveled into the future. The marble cracked. The legions faded. The emperors became names in books. But the story that began beneath Rome's shadow did not end there. It kept moving,